Have you ever stopped to think about how many stories pass before our eyes, and we simply don't see them? Subscribe to our channel right now, because today you'll learn what happened when a little girl fainted from hunger in the middle of the street. And while everyone pretended not to notice, one man, who seemed to have everything, decided to stop. But he had no idea that this gesture would change both their lives forever. Stay with me until the end, because every second of this story will touch your heart in a unique way. The winter wind cut through the empty streets like a blade, carrying with it the promise of a harsh night ahead. Alexander Hastings pulled his expensive coat tighter around his shoulders as he walked the familiar route from his office building to his penthouse apartment. At 42, he had built an empire from nothing, transforming a small tech startup into one of the city's most successful corporations. Yet success had come at a price. Loneliness had become his most faithful companion. The streetlights cast long shadows on the snow-covered sidewalks, and Alexandra found himself moving mechanically through the deserted urban landscape. Another 14-hour workday behind him, another empty apartment waiting ahead. This was his routine, his life reduced to a series of predictable patterns that offered neither joy nor sorrow, just the numbing consistency of achievement without purpose. As he approached the bus stop near the old cathedral, something caught his attention. A small figure lay motionless on the bench, barely visible beneath a thin layer of snow that had begun to accumulate on the worn wooden surface. Alexandra's first instinct was to keep walking. The city was full of people in need, and he had learned long ago that stopping to help every person in distress would consume his life entirely. But something made him pause. Perhaps it was the size of the figure, impossibly small against the backdrop of the imposing bus shelter. Perhaps it was the empty plastic bag clutched in tiny mittened hands. Or perhaps it was the way the falling snow seemed to be claiming this small person, as if the winter itself was trying to erase her existence. People hurried past, office workers eager to reach warm homes, students rushing to late-night jobs, elderly couples arm in arm against the cold. Not one of them slowed their pace. Not one of them seemed to notice the child who lay unconscious in the snow, her breath creating the faintest wisps of vapor in the frigid air. Alexandra stood there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds, watching the scene of urban indifference unfold before him. His rational mind told him to call the police, to delegate this problem to the appropriate authorities. His business instincts warned him about liability, about getting involved in situations beyond his expertise. His carefully constructed emotional walls whispered that caring was dangerous, that attachment led only to loss. But then he looked at the child's face, peaceful in unconsciousness, with rosy cheeks that spoke of health beneath the pallor of cold and exhaustion. She couldn't be more than 6 or 7 years old, and something about her reminded him of something he couldn't quite place, a memory that danced just beyond his conscious reach. Without fully understanding why, Alexandra found himself approaching the bench. His expensive Italian shoes crunched softly in the snow as he knelt beside the small figure. Up close, he could see that she was breathing steadily, her chest rising and falling beneath a worn but clean winter jacket that had seen better years. "Hey," he said softly, his voice barely audible above the wind. "Hey, little one." The child stirred at his touch, her eyelids fluttering open to reveal brown eyes that seemed too old for her young face. She looked at him with a mixture of fear and confusion, her small body tensing as if preparing to flee. "It's okay," Alexandra said, surprising himself with the gentleness in his voice. "You're safe. Are you hurt?" The little girl tried to sit up, swaying slightly as she fought against weakness and disorientation. She clutched the empty bag to her chest like a lifeline, her eyes darting between Alexandra's face and the empty streets around them. "I have to," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "I promised Mama I would bring food." The words hit Alexandra like a physical blow. Here was a child, barely old enough to cross the street safely, taking responsibility for feeding her family. The weight of that responsibility, the crushing burden of adult concerns placed on shoulders that should have been carrying only the light load of childhood dreams and games. "What's your name?" he asked, shrugging out of his coat to wrap it around her small frame. "Sophia," she replied, accepting the warmth but keeping her distance. "I have to get food for Mama. She's sick and I promised—" Alexandra felt something crack inside his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in years. Looking at this child, at Sophia, he saw echoes of his own past, fragments of memories he had spent decades trying to forget. But more than that, he saw an opportunity to be the person he had needed when he was her age, alone and afraid, in an indifferent world. The all-night diner glowed like a beacon against the storm, its neon sign flickering intermittently, but providing a welcome refuge from the biting wind. Alexandre guided Sophia through the glass doors, feeling the blast of warm air that carried the comforting aromas of coffee, bacon, and fresh bread. The contrast between the harsh winter night and this oasis of warmth seemed almost miraculous. Sophia stood frozen just inside the entrance, overwhelmed by the sudden transition from the cold street to this bright, warm space filled with the quiet conversations of late-night patrons. Alexandra noticed how she gripped the empty bag tighter, as if it were an anchor keeping her connected to her mission, to her promise to her mother. "Come on," Alexandra said gently, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. "Let's get you warmed up." He led her to a corner booth, away from the curious glances of other customers. Sophia slid across the worn vinyl seat, still wrapped in his oversized coat, which draped around her like a tent. The fluorescent lights revealed details that the darkness had hidden. The careful patches on her jeans, the way her sneakers had been reinforced with tape, the pride with which she had clearly been dressed despite their obvious poverty. A waitress approached with a practiced smile, her name tag reading Marie. She was perhaps 50, with kind eyes that had seen enough of life's hardships to recognize them in others. "What can I get you folks?" she asked, her voice warm with the kind of maternal concern that seemed to come naturally to women of her age. "Hot chocolate for the young lady," Alexandra said, then looked at Sophia. "Are you hungry?" Sophia shook her head quickly, but her stomach betrayed her with a loud growl that made her blush furiously. Alexandra pretended not to notice. "Actually, let's get some pancakes too, and maybe some scrambled eggs. I'm quite hungry myself," he lied smoothly. When Marie left, Sophia continued to stare at her hands, occasionally glancing up at Alexandra with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion. Trust, he realized, would not come easily to someone so young who had already learned that the world could be cruel and unreliable. "So, Sophia," he said, keeping his voice casual, "tell me about your mama." The mention of her mother brought light to Sophia's eyes, cutting through her wariness. "She's the most beautiful mama in the whole world," she said with the fierce loyalty of childhood. "She reads me stories every night, even when she's tired from work. And she makes the best pancakes. Well, she used to before she got sick." "What kind of work does she do?" Alexandra asked. "She cleans offices at night," Sophia replied, her voice dropping. "But she's been too sick to work for 2 weeks now. The medicine costs so much money, and we don't have enough for food and medicine both." The hot chocolate arrived, and Sophia's eyes widened at the generous dollop of whipped cream floating on top. She wrapped her small hands around the mug, absorbing its warmth, but didn't drink. "It's okay," Alexandra said softly. "Go ahead." After a moment's hesitation, Sophia took a small sip, then another. The sweetness and warmth seemed to unlock something in her, and she began to speak more freely. "Mama told me not to go out at night, but she's been sleeping for a whole day and we don't have any food left. I thought maybe I could find someone to help, or maybe find food that people threw away." She looked ashamed. "I know it's wrong to take things that aren't yours, but Mama needs to eat." Alexandra felt his chest tighten. This child was prepared to dig through garbage, to break rules that had been carefully taught to her, all out of love for her mother. The pancakes arrived golden and steaming, and Sophia stared at them as if they were made of gold. "If the mama dies, who will take me to school?" she asked suddenly, her voice small and scared. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that no 6-year-old should have to consider. Alexandra found himself searching for words that could offer comfort without making promises he might not be able to keep. "Your mama isn't going to die," he said firmly. "Sometimes people get sick, but doctors can help them get better. Have you taken her to see a doctor?" Sophia shook her head. "We don't have insurance. Mama says doctors cost too much money." Alexandra made a mental note, adding medical care to the growing list of problems that needed immediate attention. But for now, his focus was on the frightened little girl sitting across from him, mechanically eating pancakes while worry consumed her young face. "Sophia," he said, waiting until she looked up at him, "I want to help you and your mama. Will you let me?" She studied his face for a long moment, her brown eyes seeming to search for something, sincerity perhaps, or maybe just the absence of deception. "You don't even know us," she said finally. "Why would you want to help?" It was a fair question, and one Alexandra wasn't entirely sure he could answer. Why had he stopped? Why was he sitting in this diner at midnight, making promises to a child he'd never met before tonight? "Because," he said slowly, "everyone deserves help when they need it. And because you remind me that there are still good people in the world, people who keep their promises no matter what." The apartment building stood like a monument to urban neglect, its brick facade scarred by decades of weather and indifference. Missing bulbs left most of the hallways in darkness, and the elevator bore a handwritten out-of-order sign that looked permanently affixed. Alexandra followed Sophia up 3 flights of stairs, his breath visible in the unheated stairwell. "It's not much," Sophia said apologetically, her small voice echoing in the narrow corridor. "But Mama keeps it very clean." She fumbled with a key that seemed too large for her small hands, finally managing to unlock a door marked 3B. As it swung open, Alexandra was struck by the immediate cold that greeted them. The apartment was barely warmer than the hallway outside. The living room was small, but meticulously organized, every surface clean, despite the obvious poverty. A few pieces of mismatched furniture had been arranged with care, and children's drawings decorated the walls like colorful patches of hope against the faded paint. But what dominated the space was the profound silence, broken only by their footsteps and the distant sound of traffic from the street below. "Mama?" Sophia called softly, dropping Alexandra's coat and rushing toward the couch, where a figure lay motionless beneath a thin blanket. Alexandra's heart clenched as he saw Sophia's mother, a young woman, probably not yet 30, with the same brown eyes as her daughter. She was unconscious, her breathing shallow but steady, her face pale with exhaustion and illness. Even in sleep, lines of worry creased her forehead, and her hands were calloused from hard work. "She's been sleeping since yesterday," Sophia whispered, kneeling beside the couch and gently touching her mother's forehead. "I tried to wake her up for water, but she wouldn't open her eyes." Alexandra knelt beside them, his expensive suit incongruous in this sparse apartment. He could see that Sophia's mother was severely dehydrated, her lips dry and cracked. This wasn't simple sleep. This was the dangerous unconsciousness that came from the body beginning to shut down. "Sophia, I need to call for help," he said gently. "Your mama needs to see a doctor right now." Panic flashed across Sophia's face. "No, they'll take me away. Mama told me that if the government people come, they might take me to live with strangers." Alexandra felt the weight of the child's fear, understanding now why she had been wandering the streets alone rather than seeking adult help. In her world, authority figures were threats rather than sources of assistance. "I promise you," he said, looking directly into her frightened eyes, "I will not let anyone take you away from your mama. But she's very sick, and if we don't get help soon, she might get sicker. Do you trust me?" Sophia looked between Alexandra and her unconscious mother, the weight of decision heavy on her small shoulders. Finally, she nodded. Alexandra pulled out his phone and dialed 911, speaking quietly to the dispatcher while Sophia held her mother's hand. As they waited for the ambulance, he surveyed the apartment more carefully. The refrigerator was empty except for a container of expired milk and a few condiment packets. The heat had clearly been shut off, and the only source of warmth came from an electric space heater that had been unplugged, probably to save on the electric bill. "Sophia," he said, sitting beside her on the floor, "tell me about your family. Do you have grandparents, aunts or uncles, anyone who might help?" She shook her head. "Mama said her parents died when I was a baby, and my daddy—" She trailed off, looking confused. "Mama doesn't talk about him much. She just says he went away before I was born, and it's better that way." The pieces of their story were coming together. A young, single mother, probably estranged from any support system, working cleaning jobs to support herself and her daughter. No safety net, no backup plan, just the daily struggle to survive that millions of families faced in silence. The paramedics arrived with a professional efficiency that filled the small apartment with controlled urgency. As they assessed Sophia's mother and prepared her for transport, Alexandra found himself in the role of guardian, answering questions and providing what information he could. "Are you the father?" one of the paramedics asked. "No," Alexandra replied. "I'm a family friend. I'll be accompanying them to the hospital." Sophia gripped his hand tightly as they watched her mother being lifted onto a stretcher. She looked so small and fragile beneath the medical equipment, but Alexandra was relieved to see that her breathing had already improved with the oxygen mask. "Is she going to be okay?" Sophia whispered. "The doctors will take very good care of her," Alexandra assured her, though he made a mental note to ensure she received the best possible treatment, regardless of insurance or ability to pay. As they prepared to leave for the hospital, Alexandra looked around the apartment one more time. Tomorrow, he would make sure the heat was restored and the refrigerator was filled. Tonight, his focus was on keeping his promise to a frightened little girl who had already seen too much of life's harsh realities. "You always been like this? Alone?" Sophia asked, as they followed the stretcher down the hallway. The question stopped Alexandra cold. In trying to help this child and her mother, he had somehow revealed something about himself that he thought he had buried years ago. But as he looked at Sophia's trusting face, he realized that perhaps being alone didn't have to be a permanent condition. The hospital's fluorescent lights cast everything in harsh relief, making the waiting room feel more like a purgatory than a place of healing. Alexandra sat in one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs, watching Sophia color in a book that a kind nurse had provided. The child worked with intense concentration, as if the act of staying within the lines could somehow keep her world from falling apart. It had been 3 hours since they had arrived, and the doctors had finally stabilized Sophia's mother. Severe dehydration, malnutrition, and what appeared to be a respiratory infection that had gone untreated for weeks. She would recover, they assured him, but it would take time and proper medical care. "Mr. Hastings," a voice interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to see a woman in her 40s, professionally dressed, with a badge that identified her as Mrs. Patricia Weston from Child Protective Services. Alexandra's stomach clenched as he saw Sophia's body tense at the sight of the official-looking stranger. "I understand you brought in the child and her mother tonight," Mrs. Weston continued, her tone carefully neutral. "I need to ask you some questions about their living situation." Alexandra stood, instinctively moving closer to Sophia. "Of course, though I should mention that I've only just met them tonight." Mrs. Weston nodded, making notes on her clipboard. "The medical staff has informed us that the mother is severely malnourished and that their living conditions appear to be inadequate. The apartment has no heat, no food, and the mother has been unconscious for an extended period while the child was left unsupervised. Each word felt like an accusation, and Alexandra could see Sophia shrinking into herself, understanding enough of the conversation to know that her worst fears were being discussed. The standard procedure in cases like this, Mrs. Weston continued, is to place the child in emergency foster care while we assess the situation and determine whether the mother is capable of providing adequate care. No. The word came out more forcefully than Alexandra had intended. Both Mrs. Weston and Sophia looked at him in surprise. I mean, surely there are alternatives. The mother isn't neglectful. She's been working multiple jobs to support them both. She's sick, not incompetent. Mrs. Weston's expression softened slightly. Mr. Hastings, I understand your concern, but we have protocols. The child's safety is our primary concern, and leaving her in an unheated apartment with no food while her mother is hospitalized simply isn't an option. As the social worker spoke, Alexandra felt something shifting inside him, memories rising to the surface like debris after a storm. Suddenly he was 8 years old again, standing in a similar hallway while adults discussed his fate in clinical terms. His parents had died in a car accident, and there were no relatives willing or able to take him in. He remembered the feeling of being a problem to be solved rather than a child to be protected. The group home had been clean and safe, the staff professional and kind, but it had also been temporary, impersonal, a way station between one life and another. He had learned early that he could only depend on himself, that attachment led to loss, that the safest course was to build walls high enough to keep the world at bay. But looking at Sophia now, seeing the terror in her eyes as she understood that she might be separated from her mother, Alexandra realized that safety wasn't worth the price of isolation. What if I took responsibility for her temporarily? He heard himself saying. I could ensure she has proper housing, food, medical care, whatever she needs while her mother recovers. Mrs. Weston looked skeptical. Mr. Hastings, are you a relative? Do you have any previous relationship with this family? No, Alexandra admitted, but I have the resources to help them, and I'm willing to do whatever background checks or legal procedures are necessary to become her temporary guardian. Sophia looked up at him with something approaching hope, but Mrs. Weston was shaking her head. I appreciate your willingness to help, but our emergency placement procedures exist for a reason. We can't simply hand over custody to a stranger, regardless of their good intentions or financial resources. Alexandra felt frustration building in his chest, the same helpless anger he had experienced as a child when adults made decisions about his life without consulting his wishes or considering his feelings. Then what do you suggest? He asked. Because I'm not going to stand here and watch you traumatize this child by separating her from the only family she has. Mrs. Weston studied him carefully, perhaps hearing something in his voice that made her reconsider her approach. There might be options, she said slowly. If you're serious about helping, we could explore emergency kinship placement while conducting the necessary evaluations. It would require court approval and extensive background checks, but it's possible. Alexandra nodded immediately. Whatever it takes. Sophia had been listening to this entire exchange with the focused intensity of a child whose future was being decided. Now she tugged on Alexandra's sleeve. Does this mean I can stay with Mama? She asked quietly. Alexandra knelt down to her level, meeting her eyes. It means I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you and your Mama stay together. And until she's better, you'll stay with me. Is that okay with you? Sophia considered this for a moment, then nodded solemnly. I know what it is to be left behind, Alexandre said softly, more to himself than to anyone else. Mrs. Weston had overheard, and her expression grew more understanding. Mr. Hastings, may I ask about your own background with the child welfare system? Alexandra stood slowly, feeling the weight of memories he rarely allowed himself to examine. "I was placed in care when I was 8. My parents died, and there was no one else. I know what it feels like to be alone in the world, to be seen as a case file rather than a person." He looked down at Sophia, who was listening with rapt attention. "I also know that having someone believe in you, someone willing to fight for you, can make all the difference in the world." Mrs. Weston nodded thoughtfully. "I'll need to make some calls, but I think we can work something out. At least temporarily, while we get the mother back on her feet and assess the family's long-term needs." The penthouse apartment felt different with Sophia in it. What had once been Alexandra's carefully curated sanctuary of solitude now echoed with the sounds of childhood. Questions asked in a small, curious voice, the soft padding of sneakered feet across marble floors, the rustle of papers as she worked on drawings at the dining room table. 3 days had passed since they had brought Sophia home from the hospital. 3 days of learning how to share his space, his routine, his life with another person. It should have felt invasive, disruptive to the ordered world he had constructed around himself. Instead, Alexandra found himself looking forward to Sophia's chatter over breakfast, to the way she approached everything in his apartment with wonder and careful respect. "This is the biggest TV I've ever seen," Sophia had announced on their first morning together, standing before the wall-mounted screen with her hands on her hips. "Do you watch cartoons?" Alexandra had to admit that he didn't own any children's programming, leading to an emergency shopping trip that introduced him to the world of animated movies and educational shows. Now, as he worked at his laptop in the evening, the gentle sounds of Sophia's chosen program provided a soundtrack that was oddly comforting. The legal arrangements had moved forward more quickly than Mrs. Weston had initially predicted. Alexandra's background check had come back clean, his financial resources were obviously adequate, and his commitment to Sophia's welfare had impressed the family court judge. Temporary guardianship had been granted with the understanding that the arrangement would be reviewed once Sophia's mother was discharged from the hospital. The hospital visits had become a daily ritual. Every afternoon, after Alexandra finished his most urgent work, he would pick Sophia up from the daycare program the hospital provided, and together they would spend time with her mother, Elena. The young woman was recovering steadily, her strength returning as proper nutrition and medical care did their work. "You don't have to do all this," Eleanor had said to Alexandra during one of their visits, her voice weak but grateful. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "You don't need to repay anything," Alexandra had replied. "Just focus on getting better. Sophia needs her mama healthy and strong." But the truth was more complicated than that simple response suggested. In caring for Sophia, Alexandra had discovered something he hadn't known was missing from his life. The child's presence had awakened a protective instinct he thought had been buried along with his own difficult childhood. More than that, she had given him a sense of purpose that went beyond quarterly profits and market share. This morning, Alexandra sat at his dining room table, reviewing documents his lawyer had prepared. The temporary guardianship was set to expire in 2 weeks, when Eleanor would presumably be well enough to resume caring for Sophia full-time. But Alexandra had been thinking beyond the immediate crisis, considering how he could continue to support this family in the long term. "Are you working again?" Sophia asked, appearing at his elbow with her backpack already strapped on. The private school Alexandra had enrolled her in started early, and she had quickly adapted to the routine of structured learning and social interaction with children her own age. "Just reviewing some papers," Alexandra said, closing the laptop. "Are you ready for school?" Sophia nodded enthusiastically. She had thrived in the academic environment, her natural intelligence and curiosity finally given proper outlets. Her teachers reported that she was catching up quickly with her peers, despite the disruption in her early education. As they rode the elevator down to the parking garage, Sophia asked the question that had become part of their daily routine. Can we visit Mama after school? Of course, Alexandra replied. The doctors say she might be able to come home next week. Sophia's face lit up with joy, then clouded with something that might have been concern. Will I go back to the old apartment with her? It was a complicated question, one that Alexandra had been wrestling with alongside the lawyers and social workers involved in their case. The old apartment was inadequate, cold, expensive relative to Elena's income, and located in a neighborhood where a 6-year-old shouldn't have to navigate alone. But it was also Elena's home, chosen and maintained through her own efforts, a symbol of her independence and dignity. We'll figure something out, Alexandra said. The most important thing is that you and your mama are together and safe. At the school, Sophia hugged him goodbye with the unself-conscious affection of childhood, then bounded up the steps toward her classroom. Alexandra watched until she disappeared inside, marveling at how quickly she had adapted to this new environment. Children were resilient in ways that adults forgot, capable of finding joy and security, even in circumstances that would overwhelm grown-ups. His phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Weston. Court review scheduled for next Friday at 2 p.m. Please plan to attend with Elena and Sophia. The review would determine the next phase of their arrangement. Elena was almost ready for discharge, and the court would need to assess whether she could provide adequate care for Sophia. Alexandra had already spoken with his lawyers about long-term support options, financial assistance for better housing, health insurance to ensure Elena could get medical care before small problems became crises, educational support for Sophia to continue at her new school. But beyond the practical arrangements, Alexandra found himself hoping for something more. In the 3 weeks since that snowy night at the bus stop, Sophia and Eleanor had become more than a responsibility or a charitable cause. They had become family in all the ways that mattered. That evening, as they sat around the dining room table working on Sophia's homework, she looked up at him with serious brown eyes. "Alexandra," she said, "are you going to be like my Uncle Hero forever?" The question caught him off guard. Uncle Hero was Sophia's own terminology, her way of describing someone who wasn't quite family but was more than just a friend. It was, Alexandra realized, probably the most accurate description of his role in their lives. "If you want me to be," he said carefully, "then yes, I'll always be here when you need me." Sophia considered this with the gravity that children brought to important matters. Then she smiled, an expression that transformed her entire face and made Alexandra's chest feel warm and tight with unfamiliar emotions. "Good," she said simply, "because I think you need us too." Alexandra's corner office, 30 floors above the bustling city streets, had always been his kingdom, a place where decisions worth millions of dollars were made with calculated precision. But this morning, as he sat behind his massive mahogany desk, surrounded by legal documents and architectural plans, his kingdom felt different. The expensive art on the walls seemed less important than the child's drawing Sophia had made for him, which now held a place of honor next to his computer monitor. "Mr. Hastings, the attorneys from Morrison and Associates are here to see you," his assistant announced through the intercom. "Send them in," Alexandra replied, straightening his tie and shifting into his professional mode. 3 lawyers entered the office, their briefcases and serious expressions indicating this was far from a routine consultation. Alexandra had specifically sought out this firm for their expertise in non-profit law and child welfare advocacy. "Gentlemen," Alexandra began, "I've asked you here because I want to establish a foundation focused on supporting families in crisis, specifically those with children at risk of entering the foster care system due to economic hardship rather than abuse or neglect." The lead attorney, James Morrison, opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "We've prepared preliminary documents based on our initial consultation. The Hope Foundation would focus on prevention services, emergency financial assistance, housing support, healthcare coordination, and educational resources. Alexandra nodded, studying the papers spread before him. Each page represented hours of legal work, but more importantly, each section outlined ways to prevent other children from experiencing what Sophia had endured: hunger, cold, and the terror of potentially losing the only family they knew. "What about the operational structure?" Alexandra asked. "We recommend starting with a board of directors that includes social workers, educators, healthcare professionals, and business leaders," Morrison replied. "The foundation would work in partnership with existing agencies rather than duplicating services." As the lawyers detailed tax implications, staffing requirements, and regulatory compliance, Alexandra found his mind wandering to the afternoon ahead. He had promised Sophia they would visit Elena together, and then they had plans to stop at the library, where Sophia had discovered a love for books about animals and distant places. These daily routines with Sophia had revealed to Alexandra how much of life he had been missing in his pursuit of professional success. When was the last time he had read a story aloud to another person? When had he last found joy in simple activities like sharing a meal or watching the wonder on a child's face as she learned something new? "Mr. Hastings?" Morrison's voice brought him back to the present. "Did you have questions about the funding structure?" "Actually, yes," Alexandra said, focusing on the documents. "I want to ensure we can respond quickly to emergency situations. How fast can we provide assistance once a family is identified as needing help?" The lawyers exchanged glances. "That depends on several factors: verification of need, available resources, legal safeguards. We'd want to prevent fraud while maintaining efficiency." Alexandra leaned forward, his business instincts engaging. "I understand the need for due diligence, but if a child is going to bed hungry tonight, bureaucratic process shouldn't delay help until next week. Can we create an emergency response protocol?" For the next hour, they worked through the details of rapid response procedures, partnerships with local hospitals and schools for family identification, and streamlined application processes. Alexandra found himself drawing on his business experience in ways he hadn't expected: supply chain management principles applied to food distribution, customer service models adapted for family support, technology solutions for case tracking and resource allocation. "There's one more thing," Alexandra said as the meeting wound down. "I want the foundation to include a mentorship component. Successful adults paired with at-risk children, providing not just material support, but emotional guidance and advocacy." Morrison made notes. "That's more complex from a legal standpoint: background checks, training requirements, liability issues. But it's certainly possible." After the lawyers left, Alexandra remained at his desk, looking out at the city skyline. Somewhere out there were dozens, maybe hundreds of families struggling as Elena and Sophia had struggled. Children taking on adult responsibilities, parents forced to choose between medicine and food, families one emergency away from homelessness or separation. His intercom buzzed. "Mr. Hastings, you have the city planning meeting in 10 minutes. Alexandre glanced at his calendar, seeing the afternoon blocked out for a zoning committee discussion about a new commercial development. 6 months ago, this meeting would have been important to him. The development represented significant investment opportunities. Now, it felt like an interruption from more meaningful work. "Cancel it," he said. "Reschedule for next week." His assistant's surprise was audible through the intercom. Alexandre had never cancelled a business meeting for personal reasons, had never prioritized anything above the demands of corporate growth. Instead, he gathered the foundation documents and headed for the hospital. Elena was scheduled for discharge in 2 days, and there were practical matters to discuss: housing arrangements, healthcare follow-up, Sophia's continued education. But beyond the logistics, Alexandra wanted to share his vision for the foundation with Eleanor, to get her perspective as someone who had lived the struggles he was now trying to address. At the hospital, he found Sophia curled up next to her mother on the narrow bed, both of them absorbed in a picture book about penguins in Antarctica. The sight of them together, healthy, safe, connected, reminded him why this work mattered. "How are my favorite ladies today?" he asked, and Sophia looked up with a grin that made his heart skip. "Mama's coming home soon," she announced, "and she feels much better." Elena smiled, though Alexandra could see the worry still present in her eyes. Coming home meant returning to reality, to financial pressures, job searches, the daily challenge of providing for her daughter without the safety net his resources had temporarily provided. "Elena," Alexandra said, pulling up a chair beside the bed, "I want to talk with you about something, a way that maybe I can continue to help, not just you and Sophia, but other families facing similar challenges." As he outlined his plans for the foundation, Alexandra watched Elena's expression change from polite attention to genuine engagement. She asked pointed questions about implementation, shared insights from her experience navigating social services, and offered suggestions for services that weren't currently available but desperately needed. "You're creating exactly what I wished existed when I was struggling," she said finally. "Not charity that makes you feel ashamed, but support that helps you get back on your feet." Sophia, who had been listening with the focused attention of a child, trying to understand adult concepts, suddenly piped up, "Does this mean you'll help other kids like you helped me?" Alexandra nodded. "That's exactly what it means. And maybe, if it's okay with your mama, you could help me understand what kids need most when their families are having problems." Sophia's eyes lit up with the importance of being consulted as an expert. "Kids need to know their mama and daddy still love them, even when there's no food in the house, and they need someone to tell them it's not their fault." The wisdom in her simple statement struck Alexandra forcefully. In all the legal planning and operational details, he had focused on material needs, food, housing, healthcare. But Sophia had identified something equally crucial: the emotional support children needed to navigate family crises without losing their sense of security and self-worth. As visiting hours ended and they prepared to leave, Alexandra realized that the foundation was already changing him as much as he hoped it would change the lives of the families it served. For the first time in years, his work felt like more than a career. It felt like a calling. The small apartment Alexandra had secured for Elena and Sophia was nothing like his penthouse, but it radiated warmth in ways that expensive furnishings never could. Located in a safe neighborhood with good schools nearby, it featured 2 bedrooms, a sunny kitchen, and windows that looked out onto a tree-lined street where children played and neighbors knew each other's names. Elena had been home for a week now, and tonight marked a special occasion, their first family dinner together in the new apartment. Alexandra had insisted it wasn't necessary to include him in their celebration, but Sophia had been adamant that he belonged there, and Elena had quietly seconded her daughter's invitation. "You can't leave now," Sophia had argued with 6-year-old logic. "You're part of our family story." Now, as Alexandra climbed the stairs to their second-floor apartment, he carried a bottle of sparkling cider and a cake from Sophia's favorite bakery. The normalcy of the gesture, bringing dessert to a family dinner, struck him as both wonderfully ordinary and profoundly significant. Elena opened the door before he could knock, as if she had been watching for his arrival. She looked healthier than he had ever seen her, with color in her cheeks and brightness in her eyes that spoke of hope restored. More than that, she looked like herself again. Not the desperate, frightened woman he had first encountered, but a strong young mother who had weathered a crisis and emerged intact. "Right on time," she said, taking the cake box from his hands. "Sophia has been counting the minutes since she got home from school." The apartment smelled of home-cooked food and fresh flowers. Elena had splurged on a small bouquet for the dining table, a gesture that Alexandra recognized as an act of celebration and reclaimed dignity. After weeks of depending on others for survival, she was once again able to create beauty in her own space. "Alexandre!" Sophia bounded toward him, her school uniform replaced by a bright yellow dress that Elena had bought for the occasion. "Come see what Mama made." The dining table, small but perfectly set, held a feast that represented Eleanor's cultural heritage. Traditional dishes that told the story of her grandmother's recipes passed down through generations. Alexandra realized he was witnessing something sacred, a family reclaiming their traditions after a period of survival mode. "This looks incredible," Alexandra said, meaning it completely. "You didn't need to go to so much trouble." Elena shook her head, her expression serious. "This isn't trouble. This is thanks. This is celebration. This is—" She paused, searching for words. "This is what you gave back to us. The ability to be a family again, not just people surviving." As they sat around the table, Sophia chattered about her day at school, sharing stories of new friends and favorite subjects with the uninhibited joy of a child whose world had stabilized. Alexandra found himself laughing at her descriptions of playground politics and her teacher's funny habit of talking to the classroom plants. "Mrs. Rodriguez says talking to plants helps them grow," Sophia explained seriously. "Maybe that's why I grew so much since I started living with you. You talked to me a lot." The observation, delivered with innocent honesty, made both adults pause. Elena looked at Alexandra with an expression he couldn't quite read, while Alexandra felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that the changes of the past month had been mutual. "Sophia's right," Elena said quietly. "She has grown in every way. Physically, yes, but also in confidence, in her love of learning, in her sense of security. That's because of you." Alexandra felt uncomfortable with the praise, unsure how to respond to gratitude that felt too large for simple acknowledgement. "I just provided resources. You two did the real work." "No," Elena said firmly. "Resources alone don't create what happened here. Caring did. Love did. The choice to see us as people worth saving. That's what made the difference." After dinner, as Elena cleared the dishes despite Alexandra's offers to help, Sophia settled herself next to him on the small couch, a book in her lap that she wanted him to read to her. It was a ritual they had maintained throughout her stay at his apartment, and apparently one she wasn't ready to abandon now that she was home. "This one," she said, opening to a story about a lost penguin who finds a new family. "It's like us." As Alexandra read, his voice filling the quiet apartment, Elena worked in the kitchen with movements that spoke of contentment. This was what he had never known he was missing, not just the presence of other people, but the sense of belonging to something larger than himself. When the story ended, Sophia looked up at him with the direct gaze that had become familiar over the past weeks. "Alexandre," she said, "you're going to keep coming here, right? Now that I'm home with Mama?" The question hung in the air, loaded with implications that Alexandra was still learning to navigate. What was his role now that the crisis had passed? How did he fit into their restored family structure? "If you want me to visit," he said carefully, "then of course I will." Sophia considered this, then shook her head with the decisiveness of childhood. "Not visit, stay, like family." Eleanor, who had been listening from the kitchen doorway, approached with tea for the adults and hot chocolate for Sophia. "What Sophia is trying to say," she said, settling into the chair across from them, "is that we don't want you to go back to being alone. These weeks have been good for all of us." Alexandra felt tears prick at his eyes, an unfamiliar sensation that he tried to blink away. "I've never really had a family," he admitted quietly. "Well," Sophia said matter-of-factly, settling more comfortably against his side, "now you do." As the evening wound down and it came time for Sophia's bedtime routine, she insisted that Alexandra stay for story time. The three of them crowded into her small bedroom, Elena braiding Sophia's hair, while Alexandra read another chapter from her current favorite book. When Sophia finally drifted off to sleep, Elena and Alexandra moved back to the living room, where they sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, both processing the significance of the evening. "I have something to tell you," Elena said finally. "I got the job at the community center, the one with benefits and regular hours." Alexandra felt a surge of genuine happiness. "Elena, that's wonderful news. You'll be perfect for that position." She nodded, then looked at him seriously. "It means I can take care of Sophia properly now. Provide for her the way a mother should. I wanted you to know that I don't need your financial support anymore." Alexandra understood what she was offering. The opportunity to step back, to return to his previous life with the satisfaction of having helped someone through a crisis. It was a natural endpoint, the logical conclusion to their arrangement. "But," Elena continued, "what Sophia said tonight, she's right. We don't want you to leave. Not because we need your help anymore, but because we've become a family, the three of us. And families don't abandon each other when the emergency is over." Alexandra felt something break open in his chest. Years of careful emotional barriers crumbling in the face of Elena's quiet invitation. Here was what he had been searching for without knowing it. Not just the chance to help others, but the opportunity to be part of something lasting and real. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I'm not exactly an expert at family relationships." Elena smiled, the expression transforming her face. "None of us are experts, Alexandra. We're all just learning as we go." Later, as Alexandra prepared to leave for the night, Sophia appeared at her bedroom door in pajamas covered with cartoon animals. "One more question," she said sleepily. "You came back to find your brother, didn't you? Like in the stories where the hero goes back to save someone?" Alexandra knelt down to her level, understanding finally what she was asking. In helping her, he had indeed found something he had lost. Not a brother, but the part of himself that believed in connection, in family, in love. "Yes," he said softly. "I came back to find my family, and I found you." Sophia smiled with satisfaction, as if this confirmed something she had known all along. "Good night, Alexandra. See you tomorrow." As he walked back to his car, Alexandra realized that tomorrow would indeed come, and the day after that, and countless more days filled with family dinners and bedtime stories, and the ordinary miracles of belonging somewhere. For the first time in decades, he was no longer alone. 6 months later, the grand ballroom of the city's most prestigious hotel buzzed with the energy of purpose and possibility. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables filled with social workers, educators, business leaders, and families whose lives had been touched by crisis and transformed by support. Tonight marked the official launch of the Hope Foundation, and Alexandra stood at the podium, looking out over an audience that represented everything he had learned about community, compassion, and the power of human connection. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion he felt, "6 months ago I thought I understood success. I measured it in quarterly profits, stock prices, and market share. I lived in a world where efficiency was everything, where emotional attachment was seen as weakness, and where the measure of a life was what you accumulated rather than what you gave." In the front row, Sophia sat between Eleanor and Mrs. Weston, wearing a navy blue dress and a proud smile that seemed to illuminate the entire ballroom. She gave him an encouraging thumbs up, a gesture that steadied his nerves and reminded him why this moment mattered. Then I met a 6-year-old girl who collapsed from hunger on a winter night, clutching an empty bag and a promise to her sick mother. What I discovered in helping her wasn't just the extent of need in our community, but the profound transformation that occurs when we choose connection over isolation, when we see strangers as potential family members, When we understand that our security depends not on walls we build around ourselves, but on the bridges we construct toward others. At 2, the audience was completely quiet, drawn into Alexandra's story with the attention that comes when someone speaks from authentic experience rather than prepared remarks. He could see Elena dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, and even Mrs. Weston seemed moved by his words. The Hope Foundation exists because no child should ever have to choose between school and searching for food. No parent should have to decide between medicine and rent. No family should face crisis alone, without support, without advocates, without hope. Alexandra paused, looking directly at Sophia, who was listening with the serious concentration she brought to important moments. But this foundation exists for another reason as well, because in helping others, we discover who we really are. In opening our hearts to strangers, we find our own healing. In choosing to stay when others walk away, we build the kind of community where everyone can thrive. No. The presentation that followed outlined the Foundation's comprehensive approach to family support, emergency assistance programs that could respond within hours rather than weeks, partnerships with schools to identify at-risk children before crises became catastrophic, job training and placement services for parents, mental health support for families dealing with trauma, and perhaps most importantly, a mentorship program that paired successful adults with children who needed advocates and role models. We've already seen remarkable results, Alexandra continued, clicking to a slide that showed statistics from their pilot programs. 37 families have received emergency assistance that prevented eviction or utility shutoffs. 43 children have been enrolled in educational support programs that have improved their academic performance by an average of 2-letter grades. 18 parents have completed job training programs and found stable employment with benefits. But beyond the numbers, Alexandra shared stories that illustrated the human impact of the Foundation's work. Maria, a single mother of 3, who had been one day away from homelessness before receiving emergency rent assistance and job placement support. David, a father whose construction injury had left him unable to work, who had been retrained as a computer technician and was now supporting his family with steady income. Ashley, a teenager whose academic potential had been nearly lost to the instability of her family's housing situation, who was now thriving in school and planning for college. Each of these stories represents a family that remained intact, children who stayed in their schools and communities, parents who maintained their dignity while receiving the support they needed to overcome temporary crises, Alexandra said. As he reached the conclusion of his presentation, Alexandra felt the weight of how much his own life had changed since that snowy night at the bus stop. The Foundation had become more than his passion project. It had become his life's work, the organizing principle around which all other decisions revolved. "I want to introduce you to someone who taught me what real courage looks like," he said, gesturing toward Sophia. Sophia Martinez, who at 6 years old took on the responsibility of trying to feed her sick mother, who collapsed from exhaustion and hunger but never gave up hope, who showed me that love means never stopping trying, even when you're small and scared and the world feels impossibly large. Sophia stood up with the poise that had developed over the past months. No longer the frightened child Alexandra had first encountered, but a confident little girl who understood she was loved and valued. "Sophia, would you like to tell everyone why the Hope Foundation matters to kids like you?" Sophia approached the microphone with the fearlessness of childhood, adjusting it to her height with the help of a technician. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly throughout the ballroom. "Before Alexandra found me, I thought it was my job to take care of Mama all by myself," she said, her words simple but profound. "I thought if I couldn't fix everything, it meant I wasn't a good daughter. The Hope Foundation helps kids understand that it's okay to be kids and it helps mamas and papas get the help they need so their kids can just be kids. The applause that followed was sustained and heartfelt, but Sophia wasn't finished. And it helps lonely grown-ups remember how to be part of a family, she added, looking directly at Alexandra with the directness that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. The evening concluded with commitments of support that exceeded Alexandra's most optimistic projections. Local businesses pledged ongoing funding, professional service providers offered pro bono support, and dozens of individuals signed up for the mentorship program. More importantly, the foundation had gained community awareness and support that would sustain its work for years to come. As the crowd began to disperse, Alexandra found himself surrounded by well-wishers and potential partners. But his attention was drawn to Sophia and Elena, who waited patiently for the conversations to wind down. "How did I do?" he asked Sophia when he was finally able to reach them. "You did perfect," she said, hugging him around the waist. "Now can we go get ice cream? All this fancy food made me want something simple." Elena laughed, the sound musical and free. Some things never change. Success or no success, Sophia still has the priorities of a 6-year-old. As they left the hotel together, Alexandra reflected on how success felt different now than it had 6 months ago. The foundation launch was certainly an achievement, but it paled in comparison to the simple joy of walking down the street with his chosen family, planning their next small adventure together. "Alexandra," Sophia said as they settled into his car, "do you think we helped people tonight?" "I think," Alexandra replied, looking at her in the rearview mirror, "we reminded people that helping others is really just another way of helping ourselves find home." Sophia nodded with satisfaction, already moving on to more immediate concerns, like what flavor of ice cream would best complement such an important evening. But Alexandra knew that tonight had planted seeds that would grow for years to come, creating ripples of support and connection that would reach families he might never meet. The Hope Foundation was no longer just an idea or even just a charitable organization. It had become a living testament to the truth Sophia had taught him, that we are all responsible for each other, and that the smallest acts of love can transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. Months later, on another cold night, Alexandra and Sophia sat together in the same 24-hour diner where their story had truly begun. Sophia now wore a school uniform and spoke enthusiastically about her classes, her friends, and her dreams of becoming a veterinarian. Alexandra ordered 2 cups of hot chocolate, extra whipped cream. "Why did you stop that day?" Sophia asked, swinging her legs from the booth seat. Alexandra smiled, remembering that frightened little girl and seeing the confident child she had become. "Because I saw my past and decided to change our future." They clinked their mugs together in a toast. The silence of that winter night had been transformed into something welcoming, something that spoke of connection rather than isolation. And in that moment, Alexandra knew he had finally found his way home. Sometimes a simple gesture can change an entire life. Alexandra stopped instinctively, but it was Sophia who helped him find a new path. "What about you? Have you ever witnessed something like this? Were you the one who stopped or the one who walked right by? Comment below. Which part of this story touched you the most? And tell me, from which country are you watching? I want to know how far this message reached. If this story touched you, like it, share it with someone special, and subscribe to the channel, because here each story is a reminder that empathy still exists and transforms.